Ahora. Buenas tardes. If anybody needs translation, because some of us are going to speak in Spanish, so there is some headphones and simultaneous translation. Bueno, buenas tardes a todos. Muchas gracias por haber venido. En especial a los que estáis en el taller, que es un momento malo porque ahora se están acabando los proyectos. Queríamos hacer una actividad especial dentro del seminario de este Interactivos, porque se cumplen 10 años de la primera vez que hubo un Interactivos, fue en abril, más o menos en abril de 2006, y pensábamos que era una buena idea hacer una mesa redonda para pensar qué ha pasado en estos 10 años y cuáles son las expectativas para el futuro. Entonces, en la mesa están, voy a mencionarlos por orden de proximidad. A mi izquierda está Hans-Christoph Steiner. Hans fue una de las primeras personas, de los primeros mentores de aquel taller de 2006, junto con David Cuartielles y con Zachary Lieberman, que no ha podido venir, el que echamos de menos. Y Hans ahora está viviendo en Austria, en un proyecto que se llama The Guardian Project, pero en aquel momento él vino porque era uno de los desarrolladores de Pure Data. Más allá está David Cuartielles. Con David habíamos organizado un taller de Arduino en el año 2005, en octubre de 2005, y fue un taller muy revelador. Hace unos meses recuerdo que Tere Badía, que es la directora de Hangar, un centro de producción de Barcelona, decía que en torno a ese año hubo un cambio muy grande en Hangar, y fue a partir de la introducción de Arduino, ¿no? del modelo de funcionamiento, de las personas que se implicaban. De repente empezaron a entrar diseñadores, ingenieros, a hacer proyectos también en ese centro de producción para artistas. Fue un momento crucial. Yo creo que también para Media Lab Madrid en aquel momento también fue un cambio importante, y sobre todo a partir de ese taller y de un taller anterior que se había hecho sobre processing con Zachary Lieberman, decidimos organizar un taller más amplio, y estuvimos hablando también con Hans y con Casey Rees, que pudo venir un tiempo al taller en aquel momento. Es decir, vamos a hacer algo, no un taller corto de prototipado rápido. Me acuerdo que en aquel taller de Arduino de octubre, el último día era trae tus cacharros viejos y hagamos algo con ellos, y salieron cosas. Salió un violín interactivo que luego se presentó en el Doorbot, y vimos que esta idea de la computación física, la idea del hardware libre, habilitaba formas de utilizar el espacio, en ese caso en un centro cultural, como lugar de producción y de conectar a gente muy diferente, ¿no? Ese modelo realmente nos sirvió de inspiración para luego poner en marcha Interactivos, que luego ha sido una influencia, yo creo, muy grande para todo el resto de Media Lab, que en definitiva funciona como un lugar donde personas que tienen un proyecto pueden conectarse con potenciales colaboradores, formar grupos de trabajo y desarrollar los proyectos, ¿no? O sea, que yo creo que para nosotros fue muy importante. Y en ediciones posteriores, me acuerdo en el año 2008, Chris Sugrue fue una participante, tuvo un proyecto seleccionado. En aquel momento el tema del taller era magia y tecnología, y podéis ver en la exposición Delicate Boundaries, que es el proyecto que en aquel momento se desarrolló como un prototipo y luego ha ido evolucionando. Y Chris, aparte de participar en el taller, luego vino a vivir a Madrid durante un tiempo, entonces ha sido una colaboradora habitual en distintos talleres, proyectos que se han hecho aquí. Por último, más allá está Marc Dusseller, que él vino como colaborador en el taller de ciencia de garaje, que se organizó en el año 2009. Recuerdo su llegada ahí en la Plaza de las Letras con sus gafas enormes, sigue teniéndolas, y pues él venía del campo más de la ciencia, y creo que ciencia experimental, también ciencia ciudadana, y aquí conectó con otros proyectos que luego, como él explicó el día de la presentación, permitieron pues involucrarse en otras iniciativas como Hackteria, que es un proyecto que nació de ese contexto del taller. Entonces, bueno, la presentación de los 4 ponentes me ha servido un poco también para explicar la evolución del proyecto, del modelo de Media Lab, del modelo de interactivos, que luego, como sabéis, se ha replicado también en otras ciudades, en otros contextos, y que yo creo que está muy relacionado con una idea de las tecnologías abiertas, que no están basadas solo en los aparatos en sí, sino en las personas que los utilizan y que comparten conocimiento en torno a ellas, ¿no? Conocimiento, errores, etcétera. Y eso ha servido para construir comunidad. Entonces, la pregunta que yo les haría a todos es, hace 10 años vivíamos un contexto con unas expectativas determinadas, y bueno, ahora la situación ha cambiado. Desde mi punto de vista, en gran medida, esas prácticas que podríamos decir culturales, o sea, una serie de valores, de prácticas de una economía colaborativa, de compartir, creo que se han expandido a muchos otros ámbitos, pero me gustaría también saber cuál es la opinión de todos vosotros.
Hello, I'm Hans. So I've had a kind of, I guess, usual media arts path, but working in various creative ways, and it's been to me very fascinating to watch the kind of formation of these ways of producing all sorts of things, different forms of knowledge, software, hardware, etc., and how the shape of the free software, the free hardware, all of this, the open culture around it really changes how the modes of production. So I started, a long time ago. I worked in pretty like a startup, so it's like kind of the business side. I was fortunate to get laid off when everything had collapsed in 2001, and found myself working in basically as someone who came into a building, a metal shop in Brooklyn, and wanted to have people build stuff there. So he opened his metal shop to whoever wanted to come build stuff, and we built. All sorts of people came in we really kind of formed a community around it, and then also the door was open to anyone who wanted to help out. And around the same time, I started working with Pure Data, which is, I'd had a long interest in audio, so Pure Data is then, for the first time, it was software that was free software that I could use for this. And so after learning it, and I started using it a lot, and then I got to the point where like, oh, here's a problem, or here's something I can improve, and it was free software, so I started improving it and getting sucked more and more into maybe that side of it, developing, and to the point now where I was involved very deeply in PD for 10 years, and now I'm still somewhat involved, but now working in a whole new world, which I've been very surprised to learn actually operates very similar to media arts. So now I work in digital security. If you've heard of Tor project, so I work the Guardian project. We do Tor on Android. We do all sorts of apps focused on privacy, developing new techniques, and the way this whole world works is this kind of collection of some people were artists, some people were hackers, people were just, it's interesting work, and they thought it was important, and people have showed up. And then there's also, of course, academics and other types, and this whole world organized around just this idea and producing free software and getting it out there. And so now I see this kind of arc of it, and to me, like the most important aspect of it is, I think most people when they first encounter something like free software and open hardware, think, oh, cool, now I can get this without paying for it. That's a natural reaction. That was one of my first reactions. But the most important aspect of it is that something like Interactivos, which is a great example of, which is it can, when the means of production of software is totally open like this and flexible, and people are free to do whatever they want, people can organize totally differently. So I have never seen outside of the kind of free software communities people who were producing, teaching, learning in the same event. And I mean, I see this. I don't know. And then the other side, you get to have. So, say working in my background is software mostly, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Working in software, then when you are, a small team developing software, you work very immersively together. Like for a company, and you keep it there. And really, you can't really have much, outsiders can't really have a lot of influence on it. When it's free software, someone who has expertise or not, or interest or whatever, can come along and actually just plug themselves in for a day, for a week, for a month, and really meaningfully contribute, because there's no barriers there. As the communities kind of, that idea is like, now we're seeing like communities really organizing around like that idea that like we should have I think PD is an example of that, like Arduino is an example of this, where it's like you have you have a tight community of people who work regularly, but then also an essential part of the whole process is the random people who show up for a day, for a week, for a month, or every 2 years or something like this, and really drive it forward. Or people with just really, you can see in Interactivos, just the kind of skill sets that people come with is very different than, let's say, okay, you're just going to have a class where we teach people how to write software to control video and audio. So that's, to me, the most kind of fascinating thing about all of this is how can we then, maximize that, and thinking about like how do, I think it makes people also the most engaged in the whole process. So, it's down the line.
Well, we're going to have a debate. You speak Spanish perfectly.
Not perfectly.
But you don't speak Spanish. Un poco. So if we're going to have a debate, we should stick to English, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, good. So I will speak in English then. So, so I guess the question is what has happened in the last 10 years, and since we ran Interactivos the first time, I basically had to change my role multiple times. So to me, everything that I do is extremely personal. I decided very early on that I didn't want to work in things that were not personally engaging for me. So my personal life is strongly entangled with my work in every sense. So, for example, in the beginning, I was very much nomad. So I was coming to Interactivos for several weeks. I ended up in Madrid for several months. Then I moved to Barcelona for several months again. Then I moved to Korea for several months. And then all of a sudden I became a father. And then I decided I was not going to move. So I had to have entirely different role in my community, which is the Arduino/open hardware community, because in the beginning I was working more, or my role was more of the person that goes around and talks to people on this, telling people like, these are the things you can do. I spent literally 1 year where I was teaching one workshop every week at a different city in the world, and to basically sit in my basement and for 4 hours a day answer questions in a forum. So I entirely changed my running the Arduino website that jumped from having 20 users to have 20 million users over a period of like 6 years. So what I observed over this time is that, or what I learned, I would say, is that first of all, the community, as Hans said, is something that is made of people that are lurkers for a long time, and all of a sudden one morning they wake up and say, today I'm going to change this thing. and they do something that is super meaningful, and they even probably thought about it before. But it's also made of somebody that is there every day, and that is very passionate about it, and fights for it, and then sometimes also gets very upset and forks, and and that's what keeps it alive. Because when somebody suddenly forks, then you question yourself, like, why did these people fork, and what can we do to get them back again? What did we do wrong? Is the governance model not functioning properly, or So that's the one thing I learned. I also learned to let things go. I also learned also that sometimes people fork and you need to let them go. There is it's beyond repair. You have a community of people and they think differently, and at the end of the day, they want to do something completely different. So you should just, give room for people to get closure and move on and do something else with the same thing, maybe. But that's why it's open source, right? I also learned that at some point, Hans has been speaking how he transformed his role and he changed. Basically, I'm still in the Arduino community, but I changed my role to become more of a education spokesperson. I've been teaching for 16 years at the university. I've been teaching designers and artists. When I came to Interactivos, it was not my first workshop, obviously. I had been doing this for a while. And so I had some expertise, and I started to realize that I could totally apply those processes to a different user group. I thought, if artists and designers don't necessarily know all of the technical stuff that engineers know when they start working with technology, I could apply this to people with a similar previous education in technology. And I thought, what about high school students? And I got the opportunity first with Media Lab here. We taught some workshops in 2006, I think, with high school teachers, then with the Spanish Embassy in Buenos Aires, and slowly became my main role. I started to talk to more teachers and more teachers and more teachers. And in the last 3 years, for example, I work directly with 450 schools and about 13,000 students all over Spain, Sweden, and Ecuador. And I realized that the needs of the users are more or less the same. It's like what users need in a community like this one is feel that they are somehow in control of something. They need to be empowered, and they need to feel that they have some ownership of whatever they're doing. And openness is a way of giving people ownership. That's one way. There is other ways of giving people ownership, but openness is a really, really good one. They might not do anything. They must be lurking in the community for many years, but at least they feel that they get the opportunity to change something if the opportunity comes. But also another thing that I learned is that sometimes you need to treat your users as prime-time customers. They need to get really good documentation, for example. I think one big mistake in many open source communities is that people get shitty documentation. And it's very important. If you want people to contribute, if you want the smallest person to contribute, they need to be able to understand the most complex concept. And they need a path so they can reach that concept. So they need to give them really meaningful ways to do that. And the last thing I learned is that you also need to be ready to go at some point. Personally, I'm mentally prepared to at any time say, okay, I had it. I think you said it already, not entirely, but I think you need to be ready to also, so you need to, and I say this because you need to, if you build something that is for a community, you need to build it in a way so that you are not indispensable. We were just downstairs talking about the project that some teachers are working with El Bulli, and they had the feeling that if El Bulli disappears, then the whole structure behind it disappears because it's so much of a character. But I really have the feeling that if the head people in our community disappear, the community will continue. Maybe not in the same website, maybe they will have to create a different website, but everything is there. All the tools are there so that somebody else can take over and continue the work without us. And I think that's very important. It gives me a lot of, a big peace of mind. I don't know if you can say big peace of mind, but a tremendous peace of mind. you know. And I think that if you really are building something for a greater good, you have to do it in that way, so that you do it because it's good for yourself, and it's good for me to feel that I can, let it go, and it's good for others because they can also take over. And I think that's very important. And I think that's something that we also try to transmit with Interactivo, since we're building a link to it. Like the idea that somebody proposes a project and somebody comes in and takes a bit of ownership and they build it together, and then it's exhibited together with somebody else at a completely random place as well, and it builds new synergies. And I think that's very important. I think we invented a new format, basically, by making Interactivos. And that's I think, very relevant, because it's always hard to find new formats that allow people to share. And that's it. I hand it over to you. You want cable or wireless? There you go.
Okay, thank you. So I guess I'm going to talk a little bit about two communities that I've been a part of. So I started in this kind of art and technology world, weird world that we're all in, when I was studying in New York in Parsons. And of course, when you're at university, you have a really strong community by default, or we did, in fact. But afterwards, it's a question of like, where do you go? And you are off on your own. And I think a lot of times these trying to find a community to be a part of is a difficult thing. And the open software communities, as well as a community like Media Lab, really are what gave me the ability to continue a career in this field. So I was involved with the Open Frameworks community since the very beginning. I think some of you know it kind of started a little bit from the courses that Zach Lieberman was teaching us at Parsons at the time. And he was often giving us bits of code to use, to work on, and we would share them amongst ourselves. And some years later, he and one of his students, Theo Watson, began the Open Frameworks project to make this a tool for more people. And at the beginning, I think it was, those two and maybe 3 or 4 other students who were also convinced to participate in this project. And it was, really exciting to see how that has grown over the years, because now it's huge and it has a really flourished community. So for me, that was one of the places that I made a lot of connections, not only in a practical way. It let me teach workshops, which I love doing, and convince other people to use this weird framework that we were developing. And then, also to connect with other people who are interested in the same things. And then, of course, there's the Media Lab community, which I've been a part of for a long time, that has promoted open software and hardware environments and, this community of collaboration, which, is really important in bringing people together, and not just, developing these softwares, but doing projects, actually using them and encouraging people to see the value of being a part of these communities. I'll also comment, and David was mentioning a bit about documentation, and I think that's something that I think it's interesting to see, like, a lot of these communities have been driven by people also involved in education. And I like seeing that now, there's a really strong promotion of, you don't have to be a developer, you don't have to work on the code to be a real strong part of these communities, because we also need people who are educating and contributing to the documentation, to tutorials, to learning platforms, which I think is just as valuable as people who are writing the actual code for open frameworks or for processing or any other platform. So maybe I pass it over to you.
Hello, my name is Mark. I think Marcos has briefly introduced myself in Spanish. I didn't really listen, so I'll do it again. Marc Dusseyet is my name. That's French, but I'm from Switzerland. And back in the days 2006, yes, we also have our 10 years anniversary. I left my academic research environment in nanobiotechnology and started geeking around with electronics and synthesizers. So we started a community, not an online virtual community, but just a local group of people that really liked to make electronic music, building our own synthesizers, and that got us connected to the open hardware. Even before there was open hardware, all the circuits from the analog synthesizers are usually available in huge databases, and there is a scene everywhere, I think, since the 50s, 60s. So that's how I got started with the do-it-yourself electronics, and did also a lot of workshops. So I'm also an educator, I think, like all of us. And there is something, what Hans also said, that makes these communities special is that it's not just teaching, it's not just software development, it's not just producing an artwork, it's usually a combined format of everything. And I came from this academy, from this university, and I entered this community and being quite disconnected to the global scene. We have, Swiss style, we're not connected to the rest of the world, but we reinvented the same combination of educational, art and technology communities on open hardware, mostly focusing on music. And suddenly I get a call, you want to do an Arduino workshop in Taiwan? So we did free libre open source software workshops for creative users in Taiwan a couple of years, and that got me really more connected internationally. And also there we used this combination of open source, let's say, educational means, but it was not so easy to implement them in a 3,000 years of Confucian hierarchical structures of how you teach, but it had a big influence that we introduced this open source. There's other labs that spawned out. That was all cool, geeking around with synthesizers and Arduinos, but it wasn't really connected to my own personal background in playing around with DNA molecules and lasers and whatever scientists do. When I saw online, being connected to various mail lists, that there was a Interactivos, never heard of it, about garage science, I thought this sounds like my kind of enjoyment. And I ended up here first time at Mila Prado joining a project on working on space biology in a do-it-yourself laboratory that we set up. And it was a very interesting experience that I was first time connected to this media art scene that is also connected to Mila Prado, lots of international guests, and we figured out what is already quite functional in software and hardware is not yet so much applied to people who want to work with living media, with biology, with bacteria, with tardigrades, with trees, with monkeys. So how can we, that was the discussions we had late night at beer, how can we use these methodologies, these formats of sharing and documenting work so that other people can also contribute, but not one individual piece of software like open frameworks, not one hardware educational framework like Arduino, but all life forms. And that's a bit a tricky quest. So we set up a wiki. I traveled to Bangalore, and we set up this wiki called hacteria.org, open source biological art. But now what really remained from that other communities, which are usually targeted either around the space, around a piece of software, ours was purely cultural. There was not an individual method there, and we did not manage, in fact, to set up a large community to contribute to these documentations. In the end, it was really only a network of people that shared the similar enthusiasm of exploring these open formats, but apply it to, call it bioart or biohacking. And it's good I'm the last one. That's also why I want to ask, what is the difference when communities around the space, around software, around hardware, or around nothing? And yeah, but being involved in science and open science and biohacking, it's just this year, we were also invited to organize a gathering for open science hardware, which was a 4 days workshop, seminar, on using open hardware to enable open science. And having myself also 10 years of history in the open cultures environment, I was quite surprised how a new generation is really inspired by this open something whatever, but sometimes they're not so interested in these formats that have also been a strong component, what Hans said. Open hardware does not only mean open hardware, it, I think, also implements new formats of working together, new formats of documenting and sharing your work. And in the open science movement, I'm not so sure. And so I wonder how we can promote also these other cultural phenomena and these other formats into these new open scenes. And that's a bit how I want to start the discussions. As a bad example, I see an open hardware summit and it's 8 keynote presentations, and that's it, which is a traditional model of a conference, how academia has worked very badly in sharing knowledge for 20 or hundreds or thousands of years.
I think
No.
this. We're gonna. You guys gotta use the mic. I think this is related, but for me, I wanted to kind of get into like, okay, what is it specifically that makes this work, so that we can understand when it doesn't work. And for me, one of the things I've thought about and seen in various projects. So like, I think when you're working in the kind of more open and free software way, there's an aspect. So let's say PD is a good example. It was created by one person, Miller Puckett. He started writing it by himself. And so he gave up a lot of control by publishing it openly. Anyone could mess with it, fork it, etc. But what he gained was both like freedom in how he can use it, and also a lot of people working, a freedom in how to work with other people. And I think for me that's one of the big things. So there's all sorts of traditional models of this. So like artists, there's the classic, super genius artist who does everything by themselves, and versus an artist who wants to collaborate. So in that sense, giving up a measure of control, and I think people do this to get something more out of it. And like on the science example, to me it always blew my mind that there was 2 teams of scientists working to figure out the structure of DNA in competition. They did not, so like Watson, Crick, or whatever, and then I forget the other team, they were not sharing information with each other. They wanted to be the first to discover it, but they both kind of discovered it, and they didn't talk to each other because they wanted all the credit. Like this is like the opposite extreme of that. I don't know, is that along the lines of what you're thinking, Mark? Or? Yes. Oh. Okay.
Well, since I have the cable here, I will contribute, I think. I do have a theory that I actually wrote in a paper, and it is that, like in economy, there is a circular aspect to communities as well. And at some point, I realized that the origin of computers was coming from an open community, the homebrew computer club, right? And these people created the computers until somebody realized that there was money to be made, and then they went into closing the computers and selling the computers. And then some years later, we realized that it was important to regain control of the interface, and then we went into making open source stuff again, partly inspired because of the open source software movement, or the free software movement, that helped creating operating systems that allow us getting control of the machine somehow. But then some people realized that it was possible to make money out of it and also close it down again by forcing people to compete. And I'm specifically talking about the case of MakerBot in this case. There was this clear example where they built something openly with the community, and then in parallel they created a closed source design, and then they sold the closed source design. This created a lot of controversy. And it's funny because it was actually presented at the Open Source Hardware Summit at IBM in New York. It's like the guys from MakerBot went on stage and said, by the way, we're closing down. And the funny thing in the format, because you mentioned the format, I also mentioned it in my paper, it was kind of a TED Talk format, so nobody was allowed to question or ask anything.
Same like in Austria last week.
Yeah, same as in Austria. The conversation in Austria where I was having the talk, for example, I don't really like it because the problem is that you make a statement, but you have like no chance to discuss about the statement. I think there is other formats that allow to have conversations. Basically, I made my speech and I spent 1 hour outside talking to other people that were interested in talking about it. So I do believe that there is other formats like roundtables and so on and so forth. But as I said, you were mentioning that the kids nowadays, they don't look at it, they don't see the spirit or whatever. I think it's because now people have realized that there's a chance to make money, and people feel attracted to these things because they see that there is an economic outcome of stuff as well. And I see this at makerspaces and hackerspaces. People go there, and they don't go there for the joy of knowledge, which is the reason why I started with this whole thing. They go there because they think, if I learn this thing, then I can make this project, then I can make this company, then I can make this money. And I think in my personal understanding, that's an entirely wrong approach. But I can't stop people of being people and being willing to do what they want to do. That's a bit my thought.
In a way, I think then that's your ideal community, when you can have people like that who just like, I'm in it for the money. Collaborate with people who are like, I'm going to make this free for the community, and both work towards, build something that's free and make it better, even though with their ultimate goals are totally different. And I think you do see that. Like,
the problem is that when somebody is making money and the other ones are not making money, one day this person wakes up and says, oh fuck, I would like to be able of living out of this. This guy just made $400 million. Why am I not making?
That happens also.
The
Homebrew Computer Club is a great example of that, because there was all these people making kit computers, and then Apple, they were the ones who were like, all right, this is a great idea, we're going to make it huge. But a lot of those people, I don't think they regretted spending all those hours and not making money. They found,
No, of course.
To make that kind of money, you have to give up other things.
No, I'm not talking about money being a bad thing. I'm talking about the spirit of how you build it. Like, if 90% of people are there for the money, then the spirit is entirely different than if 10% of people are there for the money, because then there's a lot of sharing going on and so on. Also, when you have a situation like we have in Spain right now, when there is such a huge level of unemployment, right, and then people are looking for alternative ways for making a living. This is a very viable way of making a living. So if somebody is making 10 and you're making only 1, there's also a competition degree there that I think poisons the development of an open source community to some extent. Anyway, that's the negative view.
How is your experience with the Arduino community? It also has some challenges, I think, about money.
There's things I can't talk about because we're in the middle of a lawsuit. I can't talk about some things, but I can say, actually, I can talk about the things I can talk. And the things I can say is that we definitely didn't start in this for the money. But when we started to pay developers and we realized we had like 60 people working on this thing, the whole thing transforms, because it transforms from like, oh, we're going to help some people building their projects, to, damn it, I need to pay, this many terabytes of traffic a month on Amazon servers, and I need to pay this CPU, and I need to pay 60 people to continue developing this platform so it works properly. So then you need to change your mindset, because it becomes a challenge. It becomes a really big challenge just to pay 60 salaries across the world. It's complicated. And I personally really admire people like Casey Reese, Ben Fry, Daniel Schiffman, or even Zachary, that are looking at foundation models, but they're in the States. I cannot build a foundation model in Europe. when we're living in 4 different countries. That doesn't work. So we need to build a company, for example, and live with the problems of having a company and what that represents, you know. And not one company, but 6 companies.
I mean, I think it's definitely true that there's a lot of hazards in the community of bringing money involved. But and where I'm working now with Guardian Project, there's about 5 of us who are basically working full time. It's like our living. We only produce free software, and we could have taken the point of view of we're officially a company. We've done pretty well. We could have taken the point of view of okay, we can get there's all these contracts we can get. We could totally get tons of contracts and blow this up, and we'll become I'll be the CTO and you'll be the CEO. That's boring to us. And so actually working with this kind of free software way, I can make a good living and focus on the parts that's interesting. And then instead of saying, okay, we're going to build this company big, what we do is okay, we know how to get money for this stuff. And, these people are doing a really much better job than we are. We'll help them get that money. And then we can work with them. And that means it's for example, Guardian Project is working with this new company called Copperhead that's trying to start a very private Android-based phone. And this is something this is awesome. We want this to happen. So we're trying to get them money. It's also all free software. So I think that's another way that it's to look at it I don't know if you could do this in the same way where in proprietary software, the fact that we're building on these open communities and we're all kind of steeped in that way of working. People are well, you know what? The old model where you go to Silicon Valley because you want to make something, and then in 5 years you're the business guy, you're the CEO, which is not really the job of making things anymore. It's now there's a lot more flexibility where you can be well, I can still make stuff, and we can grow as a community building, still the same amount of people building this towards this goal, but having more fun doing it.
Yeah, we sacrifice that. I mean, it's a bit of a different story. If we're going to talk about this, I can go on for hours, But when it comes to us, we didn't want to sacrifice in the first place our personal lives. So that came before anything else. So personally, as I said, I got a kid and I didn't want to move a step away from my kid. So I had to stay in Sweden. But my partners were living in Denmark, Switzerland, Italy, and the United States. And then we were an entirely virtual company, or there were multiple virtual companies, but we didn't earn any money for ourselves. Our concern was to pay people that were doing the job. So we had to do some job. I was working 4, 5, 6, 7 hours a day with the project to be able to raise in some capital to pay people that were making sure the software was having proper regression tests, for example. Because I didn't want to do that part, because to me it's a lot more fun to have this interaction with the teachers and make the design of how these models have to work for education and so on and so forth. So we tried to figure out a system that will work for us. And I think that the valid conclusion from this conversation is that there exist different models that we can adjust to or that we can use to have a long-term, survival or subsistence. Yeah, thank you. So it's possible to figure out different ways, and sometimes you grow accidentally. In our case, I can tell you, in 2012, I started my first large-scale education project with 2,000 students simultaneously, and it was me in a culture center not being able to pay the rent. 6 months later, I had 6 employees. 12 months later, I had 14 employees, and I had to move out from the culture center because there were so many people that nobody else could occupy the culture center. So I had to rent an office. And today we are 17, and 5 external people outsourced in the Swedish office for Arduino. And it just happened, and we didn't raise any capital. We just started working with education, and then things just happened. And we had to decide to staff because we wanted to give the best service possible, And the thing is that I don't think there is a set way of doing stuff. I think that you have to react, and you have to choose how to react given the circumstances. And in my case, being in Sweden, I had two choices. One is to be a for non-profit institution, but then I couldn't even afford the rent. Or I had to be the company, so I could actually hire proper programmers to get things done properly. So it was really a balance act. Even IKEA has a foundation in Luxembourg and not in Sweden, just to mention a funny fact. But I think, Mark, you have all the funny questions. I think you should go on.
Okay. Maybe there are also some questions from the audience. And also, I also would maybe introduce, because you were talking how these free software and free hardware communities have to make a living in the professional context, and how this is affecting the combination of a professional-oriented or business-oriented attitudes to, in comparison to more amateur or more activist approach, and how this can be combined. I think this is something interesting. But I would also like to ask you in what way these kind of practices may affect also educational context, like the university. Are universities introduces this kind of practices where there is a connection between very different disciplines? You have a scientific background, artistic background, technological background, and you found a rich environment in the connection of the three. But do you feel there are cases in the university that are interesting? Some of you are teachers, and also do they include also the people that are outside, other ways of participating, like week participation, the citizen-based projects, and so on? What is the connection with the city?
Yeah, sure. I'll start. So where I've taught at the universities, we're absolutely using open software and open hardware. Primarily because all of the people who are teaching there are using open software and open hardware. So we are teaching the things that we also use in our own practice. And it's successful to varying degrees. Sometimes it's hard convincing students of who don't know where they will use these in the professional world. But now many of these platforms are used in professional contexts, in commercial work, if that's where a student wants to go. And I think it's important that they see, the tools that we are using as artists in our own practice as well. And I know at Parsons we do invite people from outside of, who work in these communities or who practice, and to involve outside people, to give lectures, to give workshops with them, to see what their relationships are.
I don't see so many of these formats being picked up by the traditional institutions, in fact. Not at all. I wonder why. A lot of the visions of universities, of the European Union, is that we should have more integration of communities in science also. Interdisciplinarity has been there on the big window for 20 years. They even write it big on their buildings. But looking at the formats that have been developed in media arts practices, in environments like Interactivos, they seem to work. But I very rarely see them implemented. There is individual schools, we just had a discussion yesterday, I forgot where, in here, that do it very much similar. But in my own case, I was teaching a class very influenced by this do-it-yourself and interdisciplinary practice, and it took 5 years until one of my colleagues asked me what I'm doing there. And I left the job anyway. Meanwhile, it took another 2-3 years until someone really showed interest, and then we published something and developing this, do-it-yourself and using open source practice in laboratory training. And yeah, I don't think it's, even if it's been around and some people have picked it up 10 years later, I think almost none of them have been implemented. Not in art schools. I think in art schools depends on the media arts department, yes. In the other departments, I'm not so sure. And I'm not talking about use of open source software or Linux computers. I'm talking about these formats of collaboration that have been also developed in the same circles. And I really don't see it happening to be open. I don't know. Maybe in Spain it's different, but in Switzerland we're very slow in adapting these new uncontrollable things.
I've taught some in universities, and yeah, I see what you mean. There's resistance, and I think like most people want to teach what they know, and if they don't know the free software, then it's a pretty huge barrier to teach it. So that's what I've seen, a lot of resistance on the teaching side. But from my experience in teaching, mostly pure, mostly audio programming and with PD, surprise. I was able to. I mean, when you're teaching, usually, like the first class is like a ton of work to put together. And I was already very plugged into the whole PD community. Lots of people were teaching, so we just said, hey, let's like share materials. And it was immensely valuable. I mean, I could put something together by myself, but where it was super valuable to me, coming up, kind of sharing the really good examples, like something that is really simple to put together but is interesting is like the ideal teaching tool, but it's also very hard to come up with. So one person developed this, and I said, that's an awesome idea. I'm gonna, like, can I use that in the class? And like another part of that is like just honing the flow of a class, like getting, especially teaching software-related things, like, teach this before this because otherwise it's confusing, or you have to teach this before this, otherwise you won't understand it, that kind of stuff. So that, I think, for me, it made me be able to teach a better class in the same amount of time. And there's clearly a lot of benefits to the students if it's really plugged in. I mean, first, I was teaching somewhere where a lot of the students, for example, were learning Maya, this 3D software, which costs thousands of dollars. So if they became really good at Maya, either they have to be rich and spend thousands of dollars on the software, or they have to work for a company so they can get access to it. Versus something like Blender, which may be harder to learn, but then they own it afterwards, period, like in any way they want. And then even like what I've seen a lot, especially teaching at like ITP, is that a lot of students then teach. And when the materials are free and available, they know those materials, they learn from them, and they can take them and immediately start teaching without making their own materials, which can take a lot of time.
I just want to ask back, again, in this open science hardware community, it was in the news and blah, 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 and one of the strong arguments that is used in the news and also in internal journal discussion is it's going to be cheaper. Yeah. And maybe it is, but personally I'm not interested in that argument because I think these other elements, for example, what you say, there is also educational stuff that comes with it, and it's, you can modify it and all that stuff. How you feel that? I think it's the saying open source hardware for science will be cheaper, so the universities save money, will strangle the movement before it's really born. Or what do you think about that? Arduino is not a cheap microcontroller, it's an expensive microcontroller. And the success is not because Arduino was cheap, it was one of the most expensive microcontroller of history. And I wonder how you deal with that, it's also cheaper.
Well, it's not a microcontroller, it's a platform.
Exactly.
That's the title of my thesis, by the way.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, let's. I want to tackle on a couple of things. First of all, I think you're completely right in almost everything you're saying, and I agree with you. And I also agree with Hans and with you as well.
But we have to disagree.
But I'm going to disagree. I'm going to disagree, and I'm going to give you a couple of lines of discussion there. The first thing is that the really disruptive contribution of our project was not to be expensive, was actually to be cheap. And I'm going to explain this. When the Commodore 64 was created, And this is something you can read in a book that is called On the Edge. Commodore, basically, they bought a company that was making CMOS chips, and they copied a Motorola processor that was costing $300, and they were selling it for $30. That was the big competitive advantage that Commodore had. They offered a very cheap microcontroller, very cheap for the time, okay, so that anybody could build computers with it. And as a matter of fact, the Apple II was built with the KIM, which was the prototyping board used by Commodore. And the makers of the Commodore actually claim that they helped Wozniak to get the Apple II show color. But price was key, okay? The $30, which is like a very interesting price, because back then it was a lot of money, but nowadays $30 is nothing. Then, to why we chose a price, for example, we chose a price because it was exactly how much a textbook was costing. Funny enough, it was 25 euros, which was $30 at the time. It was a historical coincidence, which I find hilarious. But a development environment, everything, environment, documentation, and so on. Just a couple of years before, I bought my own development environment for doing my master thesis, and I paid 1,000 euros. So basically, we took 1,000 euros and we made it $30. So from that point of view, what we did was to disrupt the business. And this is something I was talking about the talk the other day in Vienna, and I don't know if you were at the talk or you saw the talk on the stream. And you saw I was actually talking about this fact that we disrupted the business, and then the business making the silicon disrupted our business by making boards that cost the exact price of the silicon, because they don't need to pay for the silicon. For example, the Texas Instruments 430 is called 430 because it costs $4.30, not because it's a processor that goes at 430 megahertz or whatever, right? It's called 430 because of the price. That's how much price matters. You could take the Raspberry Pi Zero, it costs $5. But it's made as a response to the cheap computer that costs $9. In essence, the cheap, the Raspberry Pi, and so back and so forth, they are fighting to take out connectors from the board to make it slightly cheaper than the previous one.
Like along the cheap lines, like to go more what he was saying. I think for students, yes, you won because it was cheaper. But then when it got into professional designers, I say like, I'm spacing the name, but like a company in New York that I did some work. The cost of the development environment was not really a factor. It was
Exactly.
a much more, it was the flexibility of the open system that made them use it.
Yeah, I mean,
As the
of course,
prototyping
but to be completely honest with you, how many development studios can buy one Arduino board? I don't care. You know, if it's about selling boards, the real user base is in students. If there is hundreds design studios versus 100,000 students, right? On the other hand, to be completely honest, we don't mass manufacture like Raspberry Pi goes out and makes 3 million boards at once. We don't do that because we work under an open source paradigm. We make small batches so that we can actually change things if something goes wrong. And we can keep control of the production at a different level. That makes our production always more expensive. We cannot be compared with others in that sense. On that regard, why don't we lower the price? That would be the next question. Because money becomes more expensive, but the board keeps the price. So we just basically make less money on the board, which is not true, but it's kind of the idea. But we keep on maintaining a system that has more and more users every time. The old users might buy new boards, might not buy new boards, but we also support a system that's open to boards that are from other people, you know. So we end up having to pay for everybody with a little bit of people. It's like kind of a Robin Hood system. We take from some to offer service to everyone.
Well, that's what I wanted to say. I don't think for a successful community around an open hardware or software that the fact that it was free was made it successful, or the fact that it was really low cost, that doesn't make an effective
Yeah,
successful
and actually I was going to
community.
say something on that I found very funny. You know, when At some point a couple of years ago, Microsoft started to sue public institutions in Latin America because public institutions, they realized they were using the pirate version of Microsoft Office. And they could track it down because the documents they were posting online, they would actually say this is a pirate version of Microsoft Office, right? So they could track them down. Even, I was in Buenos Aires when this happened, and the Spanish embassy, who had bought the license, for some reason the technician had installed a pirate version of Microsoft Office. And so the president of the Linux Foundation made a declaration about, it was this long article on El País, and they were analyzing these different things, and they were talking about these cases and how they were going out, right, like how they had allowed companies to use pirate software so that at some point they could come back and tell them, hey, you've been using pirate software for this many years, we will not sue you, but you need to pay now, which is what Bill Gates made when he created the operating system in the first place, right? But then the guys from the Linux Foundation came out and said, like, this will teach people that they can use Linux because Linux is for free. And that made me very upset. Made me very upset because the reason why you should use Linux is because it's better, not because it's for free. And that's because it's better. Yeah, in whatever way. It's better because it's free and it allows you changing it. It's better because people actually focus on giving you a better user experience. You know, right now when I get a new computer, well, this is not new, but I typically just like copy my profile and automatically installs everything, all the software that I had before. You know, I don't have to bother about rebuying any licenses or anything like that. You know, so it's better to me in every way. And I think that's the key for an open source project. You need to focus on making something better. That's why you make it. Otherwise, why do you make it? For example, Open Frameworks is a really good example. It has a competitive advantage versus processing because it's closer to the metal, so it's much better with computer vision, for example, or with sound. Processing has a lot faster learning curve, so both can coexist because they have different strengths, you know. And I think we have to focus on what makes open source better and foster that, because that's what will make it exist for a longer time. And I think, as I always say, in education, open source is key, not because you want the teachers to start hacking everything, it's because they need to get people that compete to always offer them tools that are better or cheaper and that are always in stock, because they need the tools tomorrow, not in 3 months. So open source is very important there as well. Sorry, I just went into a rant.
So do you think if we really infect all this generation of 5 and 10 years olds with this open source mentality, how will the world look like in 20 years? Are you?
No, you should take. I think they will have closed everything and make maker bots and sell them. No, it's okay.
Yeah. It's working. Yeah. I was thinking about the comment that you made about the money, and I'm sad a bit that it went towards money, especially when we are talking about a community, not about hardware or software or whatever it is. May it be that the cost gets higher not because of money but because of control, and it's also about controlling the community, keeping it in the way that you want to go instead of letting it flow in many different ways, which would be cheaper?
Yeah, it's fine. Well, I think that's the wrong perception. I mean, in a case like ours, where you can go to GitHub, fork our software, and make it yours tomorrow. Just change the branding, and it's all yours. You can take the design of the board and manufacture your own board. You know, the price argument really for us is that it's the money we need to actually get the system working, and so that it's very clear to everybody. The boards don't pay the servers. You know, we had to put up a donation page because the software is downloaded once every 3.59 seconds. You know, that means a huge amount of bandwidth, is 90 megabytes or something. So every time somebody downloads the software, it's costing us money. So we had to put up a donation button, even though we were completely against that, as a way to help us supporting the bandwidth and the development. So it's very naive to think that you can survive for very long on charity. You know, but it's more than eating. You need to pay for everything. You know, let's say that we stop Arduino tomorrow. Let's say that we close down. Imagine let's say that then we just put a single person to go out and just maintain the IP online. You will have to deal with Amazon to make sure the website keeps on running, to at least just keep the downloadings ongoing, and just to keep the definition files for the different things and so on. That's going to cost a lot of effort. I know that, for example, in processing they solved it, they get donations, but then the donations are over from a BPS provider, they have to look for somebody else. And then you have to look for somebody else. And so on and so forth.
They've gotten foundation funding.
Yeah, foundation funding. Yeah, but I mean, they need to figure out models that work for them. That's why we were discussing earlier about the models. I think people shouldn't be blinded about the idea that it's a company or it's a foundation or whatever. I think you should make the math and then just try to figure out how much it will cost you to build it, and you will realize. So, but I think it's a very valid question, actually. It's like...
One question over here. Which areas do you think it would be valuable that communities can start hacking to open and make tools around? Do you understand the idea?
Say it again.
For example, imagine nanotechnology. Okay, so we had here a teacher from Taiwan, and they were doing nanoscopes, and they were putting like laboratory nanoscopes on hands of kids, or cheaper than much cheaper than the ones in the laboratory. So, is there any field? For example, I would say like cars. For example, it would be great to. In fact, there are some over there like open source cars, or I would say, for example, energy, like smart meters. I've been discussing with some people that it would be great to have something like the Linksys router, but in the field of energy. So can you imagine of examples in which open source or free communities can follow a path that can be valuable for society?
I have one. I think the biggest pressing need would be, from my point of view, is actually so that we can build a whole computer from everything open source. And we're pretty far from that. There's a lot of control built into all of our computers. And everyone knows that Snowden leaks, all this kind of stuff. I don't know how much people follow it, but there's basically, in every Intel processor, the NSA has control. So, right now it's functional. It's nothing terrible has happened, but it could easily. So I'd say that's the biggest need. That's unfortunately very difficult. An open source CPU, there's not many people who know about CPU design. But then on the other side of that, it kind of ties back to what we were saying. I think there's tons of things that need to be done, but they tend to be boring. And people don't want to do it in their free time, and that's where Bunny is very important. Paying people to do boring free software.
Just want to pick up on the boring stuff. I think the atomic force microscope, is not such a good example of what we should open source atomic force microscope. Since the very beginning in the 90s of the first microscope, of course, how to build the microscope has completely been published as accessible knowledge in journals that are publicly accessible. So there's nothing there that is new. It's not even open. Another interesting phenomena I saw is that a lot of the knowledge is open. Very simple knowledge. There's one website called Appropedia, which shows various instructions on how to build something. It's physical hardware to build a sanitation system in low resource settings, appropriate technology. What they have to do is you have to translate all this information. So that's a very boring job. I think a lot of knowledge is out there, it's open accessibly, but it's not in the right language for those people who need it. So that's one thing. But what I saw even more is that there is a lack of a mentality that taking an idea from someone else is not valued in society so much. When I do these workshops in Indonesia, people keep asking me if they're allowed to do also that workshop the way I did it. And I say yes. Why do they ask? I really don't understand. I think more important than coming up with another open source rocket or open source whatever is getting this idea out that using an open source project and just forking it and making it even a little bit worse is good enough.
I think this came up in this work. That came up in the presentation of course as well last week, that in many ways it's not about finding these new open source projects, but really making the ones that exist more accessible and people actually using and implementing and taking them further.
Yeah, there's a lot of projects that simply die because nobody wants to take over, or nobody wants to look at what happened with OpenSSH.
They're still going.
Yeah, I know what I mean. The problem was that they had no money, so it had a vulnerability. Oversell, yeah. It was a vulnerability and so on because it's a boring thing. Nobody really looks at it, and all of a sudden,
that's a great example.
And they have a lot of money. How many millions they got from all the tech companies because everybody were using that software package. So I think there is a lot of open source technologies. Something that was actually told the other day at the Open Source Hardware Summit that was very nicely explained by the president of the association, is that by default, when you make something in hardware, it's open. You know, the whole conversation was that when you write a text, when you write code, it's copyrighted. Because the copyright law protects anything that has a written form. But when you build something, it's not copyrighted. You can protect it by putting a patent around it. You can protect it by putting an open source hardware license around it. But by default, you know, I make this table, I show this table to you, it's public domain. So, and so that's the opposite of how we think about it, because we think that this guy, this carpenter, is sitting in his carpentry making this table, and then it's his table. It's not really true. It's everybody's table. You know? Unless he goes and says, no guys, this table is actually my table, I have patent number, whatever, and when I'm patenting the way the screw goes through the wood here, that nobody else has done it before. And if you want to use the screw the same way, you have to pay me this much money, you know. And that's something really cool, because I think we should enforce it. We should enforce people to forget about, you know, showing it to people before so it becomes public domain and everything is not public from, like, by default. But I think there is a lot of technologies that are public and can be public. And since you mentioned a project, I think right now there's a very cool project in Sweden. It's a Unity car. It's an open source car. And they started making something very challenging, that is to make an open source business model. So the business model, you can download it from the website, they can take a look at it, and you can just join the process of development. And very interesting enough, it has been raising up some eyebrows. Like, guys from Tesla are interested, and, you know, people around the world are gathering around this idea of building an open source car, you know. And it's just 3D printing a car, no, it's building an open source car. And they have a very clear roadmap, let's see if they succeed. But somewhere mid next year, they should have an open source car. You know, electric car, by the way.
I just wanted to make an additional point on the earlier topic on how to contribute back to open source projects and how to sustain communities also in this sense. So kind of beyond the talk about price and sustaining financially, another example from education is from the school where I work at Victoria University in Wellington in New Zealand, is where we have a very strong focus on the general paradigm of creative coding, and in our school Arduino and processing equally compete with Maya and Unity, for example, and it's a very healthy environment. But in basically delivering graduates every year that have a very strong background in all these open creative practices, me and a couple of colleagues started noticing that essentially we are mostly creating consumers of these technologies. And we started thinking also with a couple of other people in the local community, where in Wellington, for example, there's a lot of social enterprise entrepreneurship and a lot of strong social engagement in startup communities. And we started teaching students as of last year, and we'll continue this next year on basically teaching students also how to contribute back to projects. So not only use the software and as a consumer, but also become an active community member by, for example, working on unit testing or user testing of beta versions of local companies, maybe initial small projects, and also writing documentation, for example, or in the case where there's successful student projects, whether that's on, again, Arduino platform or processing, making sure that those projects are contributed back into the communities properly with associated documentation and so forth. So I think, again, like I said, beyond the talk about whether something is free or not, or what should it cost, I think activating the community that essentially also already exists anyway, I think there's a really large potential there to scale up, because yeah, I can kind of see that in any of my classrooms.
Actually, in that line, at Malmo University, where I also work, we just had a meeting yesterday about which should be the outline of the future of our education, which is interaction design. And this whole talk about being users and consumers and so on, it's very, very present. And we were questioning ourselves, how is it even possible at our school we are not tool designers? You know, we are not the luthiers of digital technology at the school level, which I find it very interesting, because personally I'm so engaged at the being a luthier of digital technologies for everybody else. And somehow the school, and I think this is linked to the previous question that Marcos was asking, the school hasn't succeeded in letting this thing go through into the education system, you know, become part of it. Like, you know, we have the skill of being able of creating entirely new platforms for people, new tools, or adjusting existing tools to other realms. And we haven't been able of bringing this into the education somehow. And the main reflection was that, you know, teachers don't talk to one another. You know, it's like, you know, yeah, I designed the Arduino platform, sure, that no big deal. The next guy is teaching media technology. So he's teaching, I don't know, whoever author. That's it. There is no effort made in like bridging these different disciplines. And I think that also translates into this other thing, like, since we can't contribute to one another, how can we think about contributing to somebody else's project, right? Like, I really would like to know more how you guys do it with the students, because personally I would like to incorporate it. Like I do it actively myself, but it's really hard to get this message through to my students, for example. Like 1 out of 20 is over.
No, I was just going to say, I think one of the important things is that the communities that are making these platforms are doing just that, in showing that people who are new to the platform have really important and relevant contributions to make, so in terms of documentation or testing. And I think some are doing that very well. I would say like the P5.js community has been really strong in that regard, and putting it like really on their, very prominently on their website that you know, this is an important part of them building the community. So I think that's, I think it's really good if you can do it from the educational point of view with your students, but also I think it's great to see platforms take the lead and start showing people that, you know, if you are new, you're not just someone asking a question on the forum. You have an active and important place to contribute.
On the other hand, I have a question, actually. How would you feel in contributing to an, let's say, open source project when you know there is a company behind it?
I would ask, what does it mean exactly to be behind? What does exactly mean to be behind that project?
No, I'm asking this because now that you mentioned P5.js, the other day I was visiting a a Swedish company that I think, if you're interested in JavaScript, I think everybody should look at it because I think it's fantastic. Okay, it's called Evo Things, EVO Things. And what they do is a software that allows you creating a JavaScript application that runs on some sort of like an app viewer in your phone. But it goes beyond the typical app viewer. It also uses the physical devices, the sensors, uses the Bluetooth Low Energy. So if you want to prototype an application, you can totally do it like this. And I was talking to the guys, and they were not familiar with processing, for example, or P5. And I was telling them, so can you import any JavaScript in this thing? And the guy's like, yeah, sure. I said, go to P5.js website, take this thing, drag it in here. And suddenly we had a P5.js thing running in my phone in like 2 minutes, right? This is the power of open source. These guys build the whole thing completely open and in a way that without even knowing, their thing was entirely compatible with another open source project. And I was asking to myself, these guys are getting investment. They're getting like big investment. How would I feel about contributing to their thing, right?
But I think though there, because that's also something I've noticed with my students, is that it's a subtle shift in thinking, but it's a difficult one to establish. But basically making someone understand that if they contribute back in a proper way and someone coming after them can use it and therefore have a shorter learning curve, for example, that's the powerful thing. Because, for example, in our courses, and I'm sure you must see similar things, I mean all of you probably in education, that it's somehow quite annoying to see students struggle through the same learning curve year after year. Whereas if you know that, okay, they're working with these open platforms anyway, why can't we use the projects from last year? I mean, sometimes you can, obviously, but not structurally. So this is also something we're trying to establish, that how do we do this structurally? Because only then will knowledge ramp up, right? That's kind of, so I think beyond the question of whether it's suitable to contribute back if it's a company or something, I think it's just, again, that shift in thinking, that's the most difficult thing, maybe.
I think you need to talk to the teachers that are downstairs working with El Bulli. How is this project called? The guys that are working with El Bulli thing downstairs? These teachers from, okay. There is some teachers working downstairs in the Media Lab, and they're working with a project that's related to El Bulli, to the restaurant from Ferran Adrià. And we were just discussing about Ferran Adrià's educational paradigm. It's called Sapiens or something. I don't know, they were explaining, I have no idea. You know, they explained me the story. And the idea they have, and I think is pretty good, is that teachers, they face this thing that you just mentioned all the time. High school teachers, more than university teachers, because university we have the freedom to change our curriculum to some extent, so we can always make it fun for us. But teachers at high schools, they have a little bit more of a complicated time with that. And so they were discussing about how to help the teachers build their own research portfolio so that they could, keep track of what they're doing, the new things they're implementing, so they can also share it with others, and then they can also reuse it with their own students. So that if they already did...
This is the last comment. This is the last comment I'll make on this. But so what I saw, I came into this school a couple of years ago, and it's a fairly traditional design school. But like you say, there's a lot of freedom to develop new curriculum. So in New Zealand, it's interesting because different from where I'm from in the Netherlands. IP remains with the student. It doesn't belong to the university while they are a student, which I think is really interesting. So you can play with that. I saw colleagues of mine in industrial design courses. They had students sign waivers at the start of a course to sign away their IP. And it would be signed away to the school in the case there was something successful that could be commercialized. So I thought, well, I can do the same thing. So next year, in all of my courses, I'm going to have people sign waivers that attributes Creative Commons licenses to all of the work. So I can then afterwards put it in a repository and effectively establish the situation that I was just talking about. I don't know if it's going to work, but I'll probably have some people jumping up and down.
At least you're going to have a good fight. Yeah, in Sweden we have the same thing actually. The IP belongs to the students and to the researchers. Yeah.
Well, sorry, I'm afraid we have to finish now. Thank you very much, Hans, David, Chris, Mark. Thank you for coming, and thank you all for being there as well. I think we're going to continue the discussion in a bar nearby, so see you later.